Drive Time on RTE Radio 1, sponsored by Zurich. When investment performance matters, make sure your savings are with Zurich. Visit zurich.ie to find out more.
Former British soldier will appear in court next month over the killing of a young Catholic man more than 30 years ago. Aidan McAnespie was fatally shot near a border checkpoint in County Tyrone while on his way to a Gaelic football match. The soldier who fired the shot, David Holden, maintains the incident was an accident. However, a judge in Belfast today dismissed Mr. Holden's final attempt to have the case against him dropped before it reaches trial. Judge Justice O'Hara said, for many reasons the trial has to be heard sooner rather than later. Barry Lenihan reported extensively on this story over several years here on Drive Time, and he joins me now with the very latest on this. Barry, remind us briefly how we actually arrived at today's events.
23-year-old Aidan McAnespie was the youngest in a family of 7, and on Sunday the 21st of February 1988 he was on his way to play a Gaelic football match for his local club Ahalú. He had just walked through the border checkpoint at Ochnacloy on the Tyrone-Monaghan border when he was killed by a bullet fired by a soldier in a lookout post. Now, the British Army insisted the shooting was an accident. The soldier who fired the bullet, David Jonathan Holden, a member of the Grenadier Guardsmen, he was 18 at the time of the incident, now 51, and he has always maintained his wet hands slipped when moving a heavy machine gun, and so the shot was accidentally discharged. Mr. McAnespie, it's claimed, was hit in the back by a ricocheting bullet. Now, his family dispute this point, pointing to the years of harassment he had suffered going through the checkpoint at Ochnacloy, and charges against Mr. Holden, they were dropped in September 1988, but in June 2018, almost 30 years later, after a review of that decision, the North's Public Prosecution Service decided Mr. Holden should be prosecuted for the offence of gross negligence manslaughter in connection with the shooting of Aidan McAnespie.
So what happened at today's hearing at Belfast Crown Court then?
So today's hearing, it represented the conclusion of Mr. Holden's second and final attempt to have the case against him dismissed before it could reach trial, and lawyers for the Army veteran, they contended that the evidence against him was insufficient. They also pointed to previous decisions in 1988 and 2014 not to prosecute Mr. Holden, and argued any decision to proceed to trial would represent a complete turnaround in the absence of new evidence. However, the prosecution argued Mr. Holden's explanation that his wet hands slipped when moving the gun was, quote, not a tenable version of the facts, as a wet finger would not apply sufficient pressure to pull a trigger. Prosecution lawyers added that even if Mr. Holden's explanation of events had happened, it still could amount, they said, it is suggested, to gross negligence manslaughter. Ultimately, they argued it is a matter for a court to conclude how the weapon was discharged.
So the judge then, what did Justice O'Hara, no relation I should say, ultimately decide here?
Yeah, in his judgment, Justice O'Hara said, quote, at the heart of this trial is a young man who was shot dead as he walked along a country road to a GAA match. He posed no threat to anyone that Sunday afternoon, but was killed by a bullet fired from a gun which was under the control of the defendant. The case is not fresh, he added, and the evidence may be imperfect, but significantly less so than in many other cases. And Judge Justice O'Hara ultimately concluded that while different views have been taken in the past as to whether there is sufficient evidence to warrant a charge of manslaughter being brought, in his judgment there is sufficient evidence. And he sent forward David Holden for trial for the charge of manslaughter over the killing of Aidan McAnespie, dismissing Mr. Holden's second attempt to have the case quashed.
What happens now then, Barry?
So David Holden, he'll appear again before a court in Belfast on Friday the 10th of September to enter his plea, and a date for trial will be fixed thereafter, potentially, and any potential trial is expected to last between 3 and 4 weeks and be completed before Christmas. And at the end of this morning's hearing, Mr. Justice O'Hara remarked how for many reasons the trial has to be heard sooner rather than later.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because those comments appear significant in many ways, given Boris Johnson's plans for an amnesty for all Troubles-related killings.
That's it, and this is something I picked up upon with family solicitor Dara Mackin of Phoenix Law.
it is to be warmly welcomed that today's decision marks the end of the pre-trial attempts to have the case thrown out, and that the matter will now proceed to a formal trial, and a trial this side of Christmas. It has been made clear today by Mr Justice O'Hara that a trial in this case will be expedited and will be heard this side of Christmas, which has considerable significance when we look at the fact that the British government are currently proposing an end to such prosecutions. Now, the reality is the expeditious trial in this case will ensure that Mr Holan faces trial before any proposal comes into force. We believe that with the correct momentum, this matter can now proceed expeditiously and without any further delay, and certainly prior to any further change in the law.
And that is the family solicitor Dara Mackin of Phoenix Law. What of the family then, Barry? They've fought to get this to this day, to this point in the legal proceedings for so long. How are they reacting to this latest development?
And Aidan's brothers, Vincent and Sean, in the court this morning to hear these latest developments. Relief seems to be the overriding sense. They look forward now towards this trial. We can hear now from Aidan's cousin, Brian Gormley.
It's a welcome decision on behalf of the family, and it's been a relief obviously because of all the talk going around at the minute about amnesties and stuff, so you're never sure what way Aidan's case was going to be dealt with. Thankfully this morning Justice O'Hara was very clear in his ruling that, in his opinion, that there's enough evidence there that would lead to reasonable prosecution. But as a family, and this is what we've been saying from the word go, is that we now know that that court case will help to delve into some of the facts of what actually happened on that day that Aidan was shot.
All these years later, that must mean an awful lot for the family.
It does. Obviously, there's been a lot of setbacks along the road. There's been hopes have been dashed in the past, where you think you're making progress and then it's been thrown back at you. Thankfully, the family has been determined that we still would pursue this. We've had a very good legal team in terms of Dara Mackin representing us. We've had good support from people in the media that has raised the case a number of times, including yourself. And days like this, I suppose we remember Aidan's sister, Ailish. Fortunately, Ailish is no longer with us. Days like today that makes it worthwhile. A very important part of Justice O'Hara's comment today was that really what the case is about, it was about that young man walking along the country road on a Sunday that was shot dead. That young man was Aidan McAnespie. So that's what the case really is ultimately about.
Justice O'Hara saying at the heart of this trial is a young man who was shot dead as he walked along a country road to a GAA match.
He summed it up perfectly. That is what it is about, that Aidan McAnespie was shot on a Sunday afternoon and no one has been held accountable. The real place for this to be discussed and debated is in the courtroom and a public forum. Any side commentary is not necessary at this stage. I know people get frustrated that it's a long drawn out process, but I think at this stage people need to remain focused and go, let this run its course. It has to go to court, and then that's where all the debate and discussion that really matters will take place.
And that is Aidan McAnespie's cousin, Brian Gormley, ending Barry Lenihan's report there. My thanks to Barry for that.